Hello everyone. Today I will be discussing Chapter 15, Section 13, titled Neoliberalism in the Cold War. This section starts off by pointing out that the type of liberalism practiced by the US between the 1930s and really up until the 1980s was very different from John Rawls' ideas of liberal theory and justice. More specifically, he points out how anti-communism and liberalism, especially among academics, were the main ideologies that dominated American political thought. Wolin explains how the US during this time went from what he calls a New Deal ideology, which means it emphasized social welfare, civil liberties, and a certain degree of governmental planning, to creating an expansionist and or imperialist ideology by opening itself up to foreign markets and exporting American goods and American culture, and by building military bases worldwide, among other practices. In other words, there was no other political ideology that had a major influence in American political thought. As a result, American liberalism began to serve as a guide as to how the US was going to deal with foreign regimes, especially during the Cold War, that it deemed evil or as a possible threat to global democracy. Wolin explains that in the period between 1940 and 1990, the global community saw and experienced various forms of racism, genocide, a rise in nuclear proliferation, and a Cold War whose ramifications included spies, traitors, and domestic critics of the ongoing crisis. Wolin compares these events to a contemporary Hobbesian world where self preservation was transformed into actions to combat threats to national security. Wolin then starts to discuss the features of Nazi and fascist regimes in Germany and Italy before and during World War II in terms of their totalitarianism. However, it is very important to note that his idea of totalitarianism in the US, what he calls inverted totalitarianism, is very different from classical totalitarianism. Wolin explains inverted totalitarianism as the gradual replacement of social welfare, meaning programs that helped the masses, with corporate welfare. This means that businesses or the people who owned the means of production were beginning to play a bigger role in society in comparison to individual citizens. He argues that American presidential elections in the late 20th century were created and essentially branded as electing the leader of the free world. Crucial to this branding of US elections is the idea that democracy was equivalent to free elections. Wolin argues that specifically American presidential elections are anything but free, and in fact are quite expensive to run. The implication of this statement is that a majority of the citizens of the world's most famous democracy do not participate in democratic processes. Another feature of the US's inverted totalitarianism, according to Wolin, are political ads. He states that American political ads are sometimes constructed in such a way that they discourage people from voting. One of the most important arguments that Wolin puts forth is perhaps that demobilization instead of mobilization of popular support in politics was key for his new idea of American inverted totalitarianism. He states that his view of inverted totalitarianism, and more specifically its features, went unnoticed because classical totalitarianism was painted as a political system that occurs when the state accumulates an enormous and unlimited amount of power while simultaneously politicizing civil society. Wolin goes on to argue that racism was repressed by marketing it as a conceptual idea to the masses. In fact, he says it only mattered whether democracies had fought against foreign governments that practiced racial inequality, and not whether democracies held themselves accountable to racial equality. Wolin ends the section by saying that overall democracy was no longer concerned with socioeconomic issues like the ones in the New Deal, but became more entrenched with elitism. Thank you.